So before I start, do any of you have questions from the last time? Okay. So seems like we have a roughly factor of 2 fall off in the class size, so I'm going to hit my target, I'm sure, pretty rapidly. Okay, so firstly, I'll hold, besides my usual office hours tomorrow, I'll also hold an additional one from 4:30 to 6 p.m. So what I would highly encourage is come and talk with me and all, just to kind of, I guess partly just for me to get to know you, but more importantly also kind of possible project ideas and all. Tonight I'll send out some brief sort of directions. A challenge with projects and courses like these always is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, which is, of course, we are in early stages of the course, so you don't know what topics are there and what would be accessible and vice versa. So this introductory lecture that I have been doing, in some senses, in part, is about the type of topics that are there. And oftentimes in these projects, you may have to jump ahead, that in context of your specific project, kind of march ahead of the lectures in terms of picking up that material, and I will help you on in that. But for that to work, sort of talking with me so that I can then in turn point you to resources, as well as with hook you up with, for example, my postdoc Louis for discussions and all. So come and talk with me, meet me. Okay, so also I posted the recording of the previous lecture, so take a look. We'll do the same thing for today's lecture. So last time at the very end I had started, so one of the things sort of we had looked at was that how sensors can be attacked, right? And by basically manipulating the signal that the sensor was picking up. And then I had started on this thing that it's not one way you kind of attack is really kind of fooling the sensor in a very obvious manner, like putting in a spoof signal, or like I described how the magnetic field and all could be manipulated. But then there are more subtle attacks where you poison the signal that the sensor is picking, but in a manner that a nearby human or a human who's observing that signal will not see anything wrong, and yet the system gets fooled. And typically these attacks are mounted by exploiting weaknesses in the algorithms that are processing the sensor data. And in recent 4 or 5 years, a very fashionable area which has appeared in AI/ML literature is this notion of attacking sort of computer vision, natural language processing, speech recognition, these kind of systems. And an example of that are these digital assistants, where kind of people try to essentially inject hidden commands into it. So since these systems are often used to control IoT devices and all, like smart locks and things like that, so if we can inject these commands so that the occupant of that home would not be any wiser, and yet we are getting these systems to do something which is potentially dangerous, for example. So a couple of ways which are more, if you may, are still cheating the sensor, so to say. So one, as I had mentioned last time, was to put basically hidden voice commands. So kind of loosely speaking, I can hide a state, like a hidden message in a song or stuff like that. Somehow I can bury a message which, if you hear very carefully, you might be able to hear it, but it's just that kind of hiding in plain sight, so to say, or plain sound, I guess, in this. The other one, which is the more creative attack, was made use of the fact that these sensor, or the microphone in this particular case, has some interesting under the hood characteristics, and in particular the microphones so our human sound range is supposedly up to something like 20 kilohertz or so, although depending upon one's age we hear a lot less, because as we age our ear follicles, those tiny hair-like cells inside our ear, as they become less sensitive to frequency. So, like for example, by the time you're my age, you're probably listening to 10, 12 kilohertz. You guys are younger, maybe you're listening to 14, 15 kilohertz, and sort of even younger people can go much higher. But these microphones are not designed like that. They have a kind of a slow roll off, so they can they're sensitive to frequencies in the ultrasound range all the way quite a way up into like 40, 50, 60 kilohertz even. So some groups out of Illinois, China, a few different groups have shown that we could put essentially signal in those upper bands, which obviously a nearby human will not hear, but then the non-linearity inside the sound circuitry essentially reflects back those signals into the audible band. So those of you who are electrical engineers, where kind of when you sample a signal, we have aliasing of the frequency that happens. So long story short, you can basically make it appear as if actually the digitized sound actually does have that hidden voice, which was actually out in the ultrasound regime. But these are still sensor level attacks. The more interesting ones have been where you basically, it's just the audible band sound, but we have perturbed the sound in a manner which a human cannot decipher, so like very low level noise, and yet the machine learning algorithms interpret it differently. And there's the same version of things you might have read about in popular press and all also, which are things like there is an image, all humans think, oh, it's a cat, but the computer vision algorithm thinks it's a dog, even though after you have perturbed the image. Okay, so in these cases, what's happening is that the algorithms are these neural networks, and they have very complicated decision surfaces. So they think of the data space, and you're kind of dividing, you have a decision boundary within that. So what these attack strategies do is they make use of the fact that closer to that decision surface, if I perturb the image or sound signal just the right manner, then I can fool the algorithm, and yet not fool the human. So very tiny amount of noise added to sound or image or whatever signal, and we fool the algorithms. So there are many kind of different ways one could go around developing these things. So in some cases, you know what the algorithm is, and then intuitively the idea is I start out with my signal, let's say some sort of sound waveform, and then we perturb by adding noise to it all over the samples or all over the pixels in case of images in such a manner by so that we get in the direction which will cause a wrong decision to be made. So just like we train a network using backpropagation, we basically fool it by making use of marching in that direction, which takes us to the wrong label. So if I want to have the image of a dog be declared a cat, then I'm start out with that image of a dog, but I'm going to add noise, and then I'm going to walk in the direction which is closest to where the cat region lies, and likewise in case of sound. Now sound is a lot more difficult because we humans are also, when you are adding these things, you also need to make sure that not only it appears genuine, but it also makes grammatical sense. There are language models and all that also need to be followed. So a student of mine who graduated a year or so ago, he did some work in this space. We're attacking kind of devices like Alexa and all, and there are a couple of other groups who have done some very prominent work in this space. So we basically take the waveform and we systematically kind of optimize it. So what happens in this particular case is that the attack he did was on single word. So like a command like yes would we get the machine to interpret as no, even though a nearby human or most humans will still hear it as a yes. Since then, I mean, sort of people have done additional work, so this continues to be kind of an area of interest. One possible project topic in this space is, well, a couple of them. So firstly, look at other types of sensory data and mounting similar attacks on them. So like, for example, location traces or traces from inertial sensors and devices, those kind of things. Again, remember, the goal is that I have an original test input, which the algorithm, the machine learning algorithm, classifies it one particular way, and the humans agree with that classification. Your goal is to modify it ever so imperceptibly, so the human still thinks it's represents the original class, but the algorithm will declare it differently. So there's several possible potential project directions out here. One is to look at some of other type of sensory data, like maybe radar images or LiDAR images or things like that. That's one possibility. Within the confines of acoustic or sound data, one of the things is mounting these attacks over the air. So what I mean by that is that there is a version of these attacks where you already have a digital representation, a digital image or a digital sound waveform, and you're manipulating that. But that means that the adversary has already gotten inside your computer. But could I mount these attacks in the analog domain as an outside? So for example, one group has shown that by putting a transparent sheet on top of a camera, but the sheet has some carefully printed scratches in it, we can now fool the camera into misclassification. Okay, so still seeing the real scene. Or another one where people put a little sticker out on the world, and then that fools the thing. So these are examples where I'm not hacking into the camera or the sensing device. I'm kind of manipulating the physical world, but the humans won't notice anything. So like imagine a stop sign and there's a little sticker on it. We'll see, okay, it's just nothing out of the ordinary, but that sticker is designed to fool the algorithm. So that would be another one. And a third possibility out here is that I think these notions of imperceptibility to a human inherently is about a human. So if I see an image, not all humans may agree to it, or depending upon how time limited a human is, like I show you an image and quickly flash it and remove it, you may have a very different decision about it than if you get to stare at it for a long time. Or for example, humans are colorblind, or some humans are colorblind, or we are sensitive to different colors or lighting conditions, and also there are many different ways you can go around hiding information to fool the algorithm. And this, so you could also another possible direction is to make use of humans' perception limitations to mount more intelligent attacks. So for example, maybe I should add noise to those regions where human is less sensitive to. Like when we look at an image, then we tend to focus on the dominant object. If there is an image of a person in it, then we tend to focus on that, and we kind of have our blinders to other parts of the images. So it's easier to hide information where we have less attention to. So that's another direction one can take. So this area of adversarial input, as it is called, is ripe opportunities for project ideas, and again kind of a very timely topic. More broadly, doing AI ML in adversarial settings is a rich area for projects, and to understand what kind of this means is if you look at an overall life cycle of how today we go around designing systems which use modern machine learning methods to do some sort of analysis on sensory input. Typically what happens is there is kind of this learning phase, model learning phase, and then there is an inferencing phase. So if you think of the whole thing as a life cycle, we start out by one of this initial phase where we collect data from a whole bunch of users, and that's a time sort of labeled training data. So if we are doing camera images and what's the class, but more typically with sensory information and all, what happens is people are given phones, the sensors are collecting data, but some app on the phone periodically asks them, what were you doing? Were you walking or running or stuff like that? So the humans kind of label that data, and then all that data are then used to train a model. Neural model nowadays typically, we take that model and then we deploy it onto some sort of service or some sort of device, and then to that device we give the actual test input, and then the model operates on it, and the output is cross label or some estimated value, and then that's fed to some sort of a decision maker, whether a human or some control algorithm, and then it takes some decision on it, right? So that's kind of the big picture of what these systems kind of look like. Now, what are the adversarial issues in this context? So one kind of issue is that we basically are seeking to corrupt the model itself, okay? So the model is not what it would be in the absence of an adversary. So one way one could do it is that some of our data providers are manipulate the thing. So instead of when they are labeling, they maliciously mislabel the data. So that's one type of attack. Kind of noted it like here. Another one is that typically this model training and all is done by some vendor or some service, right? I mean, very common nowadays. Kind of there are these AI ML as a service type platforms. You upload their labeled data and then they kind of generate the model for you. They do the training. Or in many cases, you are sort of, there are companies which are doing this job for you. They could manipulate the thing, right? So they could deliberately, the data may be pristine with correct labels and all, but during training, they deliberately maybe manipulate some of the weights and all. End effect is the same. Again, I have a model which has been compromised in some manner. So one of the things that sort of people concerned quite a bit is that somewhere in the supply chain, the model has been manipulated so that in effect, the equivalent of a virus or a malware is now in my model. And since my program is really, if you think about what an AI ML type program does, really the intelligence is in this model, right? The rest of the program is very simple. It just executes the model. So the analogy out here is this is like a traditional, what's happening is we are basically putting in a virus or malware, except this virus or malware is really in the weights of this model, in the parameters of this model. It makes it much harder to detect. So, for example, I may put a trapdoor out here, which whenever it sees a particular thing in the signal, would then cause it to fail. So like my sensor would operate correctly most of the time, but whenever it sees this trigger in the input, like let's say a yellow sticky note at the corner of the image or a particular frequency tone in the sound, it will now misbehave. So that's this model. So this is kind of the model-based type attack. So training data poisoning the training algorithm, and then directly sort of tampering with the model. These are some of the vectors you might imagine. Another one is, which I kind of already discussed in the preceding slides, is that we manipulate the input source. So this is where we are manipulating the input so that when fed to a correct model, it is basically exploiting fragility in the model. So all that stuff about the decision surface that I talked about, so that an incorrect result is produced. So in this case, the model is all correct, but I am basically sort of manipulating the input in an imperceptible manner so that it remains undetectable, but now produces an incorrect result. Long sort of end goal in all cases is we want to subvert the decision making that is going on, right? So for example, we might want to get the car to crash, like car is supposedly doing lane following, let's say, but maybe by putting some subtle things on the road, I can cause this car to veer to the left or right and then crash. People have shown these things like the lane following in some of these autonomous vehicles. If you put certain stickers on the road, it basically fools the algorithm and they sort of go around crashing. Or increasingly now, like for example, Tesla's autopilot now, they've introduced a stop sign recognition system. If something sooner or later, they're probably going to have like after seeing a stop sign, it actually is supposed to stop, but maybe it won't if we manipulate these. So that's kind of the overall thing, and there are a whole bunch of, again, activities around this. How do we attack? How do we defend? Can we defend against some data being corrupted? Can I detect that a model has a trapdoor or backdoor, as it's called? How do I manipulate the input, and can I defend against poisoned input? Okay, there are all these kind of topics one can imagine, and again in context of different sensing modalities. Also interesting might be to explore, can I simultaneously fool? So what I mean by that is, there is work on images, there is work on sound. But if I have a sensor which looks at both image and sound to then identify something about the scene, can I do poisoning, which is multimodal? That is, I can simultaneously manipulate both sound and image so as to cause these things. So there are lots of possible sort of directions, possible project directions want to explore, both from attack side and kind of defense side. There is also a privacy issue out here, which is the following. These individuals are contributing their data, right? Label data, sensors, and the model will be trained. Someone who has this model, if they can reverse engineer as to what the data were, then again there is a loss of privacy. So again, this is something people have, much of the work which has happened in this space is usually with images, sound, and natural language text. Other type of sensing data modalities are kind of largely wide open territory. So looking at some of those questions from a privacy perspective could be another space, which largely boils down to, how do I train such that I'm not revealing, the model doesn't reveal about the input data. So that's privacy preserving computation. Another issue which exists in these spaces is those who are after intellectual property theft. So I train a model with a lot of effort and a lot of costly data, and then I hand over the model to you, and I want to make sure that you are not going to reverse engineer the model, because then you can just run it on your own server and then not pay me. So how do I protect these models? So one way is that we kind of run these things in as a service. But another possibility is that I hand over the model, but the model runs in some sort of an obfuscated, encrypted manner, and then it is protected. And the final one is, scenario is that I have a model, I'm running the service, you are going to send me the test data, and I'm going to give you the result. But your test data itself is private. Maybe it's images, maybe it's sound. We have all heard about things like how the privacy concerns around like sound, which these digital assistants take and all. So is there a way I can design these things so that I don't give you the model, because then you will run away with the model. You are going to still send me the data, but maybe you send the data in an encrypted manner and don't give me the key, and I'm still able to work on top of that. So there is something called cryptonets, and the idea there is that they operate on encrypted data, and they make use of a particular form of cryptography, which is called as homomorphic encryption. So normally what happens in encryption is the following. Let's say I have some data, I want to send it to a server for execution. So I encrypt the data, I ship it over, but then I give the key to the server, it decrypts the data, it processes it, gets the result, sends the result to me. So in that case, I'm only protecting against someone who is snooping on the communication link. What homomorphic encryption does is, I will encrypt the data, I'll send it to the server doesn't have the key, it runs on the encrypted data, and then produces a result which is also encrypted, so server is no more wiser, but doesn't get to see the data. I get this result and I decrypt it. And the reason it refers to as homomorphic in mathematical terms means is that if I'm applying two operations, f and g, then f of g of x, that is, I take x, apply the function g, and then apply the function f, is the same as g of f of x. So f and g comes. So it turns out, some years ago, people showed that homomorphic encryption can be done, and while it is a lot slower, but for a lot of these things, particularly for certain type of computation, is still good enough. So there is actually a library called PySift, which is for homomorphic, which is for privacy preserving machine learning, and they have these kind of implementations. So another project direction to explore is how to do these kind of things. We are training a model or making an inference while still preserving the privacy of the test data. Okay. And things to explore there might be either study like what are the performance relative to, like what's the performance penalty of privacy, if you may. So that could be one direction. Another direction could be implementation for more resource constrained platforms like sort of microcontroller or Raspberry Pis or these kind of things, or maybe even an FPGA type implementation. So privacy could be another direction to explore. But in any event, this is like if you look at conference proceedings in MLAI space, it's kind of a pretty active topic with sort of a lot of actions happening, and the reason, I mean, philosophically, in a sense, the way we write programs has changed, right? I mean, previously, a lot of our sensor analytics and control algorithms and all were kind of, the intelligence was in the control flow of the program. But now, the intelligence is in the data that the program works on, okay, in those matrices. So the way we attack and the way we defend have all kind of changed considerably. So to summarize, there are training type attacks and there are inference time attacks, and then you can have the attack and the defense perspective. And much of the work, as I said, currently has been for images and far less so on sound, and and then some work on natural language text. Other sensing modalities, multiple modalities, those are all interesting directions to explore. Okay, countermeasures. So last time around, I had talked about, very briefly talked about, so when I don't have slides on this, so but just to take an example, let's take countermeasures. So let's say I'm defending against an attacker who is manipulating the sensor signal so that the algorithm gets fooled. How would you go around defending against this? Can you think of some strategies?
You can use some sort of like authentication schemes.
Where would that go? And authenticate who?
I mean, whether the authenticator is coming from the direct source.
Yeah, but I mean, the adversary, that source itself may be the adversary, right? I mean, this manipulating. So authentication fortunately helps. You're right that authentication makes sure that I'm receiving it from a allowed source. But the allowed source itself may be tampering the data, right? For example, Facebook now has filters when I upload image which is manipulated in some manner, then they try to censor it, right? Or whatever, not display it. So I am the uploader and I'm also Facebook's adversary because I want to have that image slip through their filter, for example, right? So authentication doesn't help in those settings. Defense has to lie entirely kind of somehow okay.
So is the goal of the attacker to mess with the system and produce an output that?
Yes, is it correct, right? I mean, that's what we're trying to do. And my goal is, defender's goal is that I want the result to still be what it was. Yeah. Okay. Why don't you go?
Would it be possible to train on different adversarial attacks that would be able to recognize that?
Absolutely. So that's one type of defense. So what you can say, is that I'm going to train a model where at training time I'm going to subject it to attacked test inputs and thereby develop resilience to it. And some people haven't really explored it. Limitations to it doesn't quite fully work, but certainly a valid, reasonable approach. Yeah.
Taking like an ensemble type approach.
Okay, excellent. So I can, since the way we add noise is designed to a particular model, so I can have a bank of models and either vote on them or randomly pick one of them so the adversary doesn't know. So now the adversary has a harder task, right? It has to design an attack which will work across multiple models, much harder thing to do. So you can see some of these things. And then another one is to actually come up with ways to create a single model which is robust. Okay, it attempts to detect maybe the fact that we add noise, I can detect that noise being added. So there's some work like that as well. So there are all these strategies, but this is a pretty hot area of research. Again, how to create algorithms or whatever, how to create models which are robust to such tampering. So that so that's one area, and the other one, as I said, is kind of the attack. Lot happening in this space. The other area of countermeasures is that how do I make the sensor itself more robust? Remember an earlier set of attacks I described where we are messing with this signal that is getting into the sensor, and this is where I had mentioned that last time towards the end, that passive sensing, where I passively listen to whatever signal energy is coming to the sensor and then try to make sense out of it, is always intrinsic going to be insecure, right? Because the adversary has the ability to manipulate it. So the notion which works typically better is to make use of active sensors. And the idea behind active sensors is that these active sensors, instead of simply measuring the energy which happens to be coming in, they themselves emit some energy, that some signal. That signal interacts with the physical world, and then you get back the reflected signal, crudely speaking, and then you look at that reflected signal. But the reflected signal is a function of what you sent out. And so if you embed in that signal you were sending out some sort of a secret, then the adversary hands get tied. So in context of that wheel speed sensor that I had mentioned, so originally what was happening was that the wheel speed sensor was simply a magnetic sensor, and it was basically measuring the change in signal strength of the magnetic field, but the magnetic field itself was from a permanent magnet. What this difference does is that the sensor now also has an active element. In this case, essentially it's an electromagnet which generates a magnetic field. And what it does is, crudely speaking, at some random times, it nulls out the random magnetic field. Okay, so it's kind of, think of it like a challenge. At some random time, it makes the magnetic field 0. Adversary doesn't know that, right? Because all of this is part of my trusted sensing side. Adversary is external. So adversary has to now detect that when this thing is going to go down to 0, but the speed with which it can do that is limited. So now I'm making use of the fact that adversary cannot predict when the magnetic field is going to go to 0. So there will be a certain lag where I know magnetic field is 0, therefore I should be getting a 0 signal back, but the adversary didn't, so there will be a period of time where adversary will still slip through, and then I won't be able to detect it. So what we are doing in this case is we are making use of two things that work to a defender's advantage. One is randomness. If we do something random, adversary cannot predict it by definition, and therefore I can mount a defense. And the other is physical constraints. There are certain things adversary can't do. So circuits, whatever circuit adversary will have some delay. You don't have 0 delay circuits. Or if it has to do a computation, there is no such. Or if a packet has to travel back and forth, there is a speed of light limitation. So there are certain physics limitations that will always exist and that constrain the adversary. So randomness and physics, those are two friends of a defender. Okay, and I guess the third one you can say is diversity, which when you mention the ensemble of models, that's an example, right? I kind of bring to bear multiple things, and it would be very hard for the adversary to simultaneously be able to sort of mount an attack. Okay, so the countermeasures, better sensors, redundancy of sensors, active sensors. There are algorithms which are designed to be more secure and resilient, and then also sort of some sort of verification method being wrapped around it. So there are kind of whole bunch of things happening in this direction. Another exciting technology that has emerged is this concept of secure hardware enclaves. So it's a technology which started out with the following premise, that traditionally when we run an application on a platform, then we basically take it for granted that we trust the platform. In particular, we trust not only the processor, but we also trust the operating system. And really what we try to defend against is other applications. We want to make sure that applications don't mess with the operating system so that the operating system remains trusted, and that any given application trusts the OS and secure in the knowledge that the OS is trusted, it therefore is protecting it against the other applications. But that's often not the case. Oftentimes what happens is that the OS gets compromised, right? There are bugs and whatnot, so gets compromised. So you want to defend the application against a malicious platform. So for example, this may happen, let's say you have very private sensor data and you want to execute a model on it and then get the result. So you're going to send it to a service, and say some virtual machine running out in the cloud, but what if things have been compromised? So you want to protect this data even from the OS. So what these hardware enclaves say is the following. They say, okay, let's figure out a way if we can do processing even when the OS is untrusted, but we still trust the hardware. So we trust Intel, but we no longer trust.
Okay, I found this on the web for let's figure a way we can process
Gosh, so much for privacy. Question or okay. So we want to trust. We still trust the processor, but not kind of the intervening layers of software. So what this trusted hardware enclaves do, and most manufacturers provide, is that essentially there is a hardware enforced secure mode, and when you are running in that secure mode, then the OS cannot mess with you. Okay, and there are a couple of aspects of what we mean by unnecessary. One is that anything you read and write to the memory inside this cannot be read by this operating system. Specifically, the data and all that are written, those memory pages are encrypted. Okay, and the keys to that encryption are known only to the application, and it's mediated by the hardware vendor. Okay, so the OS is out of the loop. And the other one is that access to certain sensors and actuators and external devices are limited to the secure world, and even the operating system running in the normal world will not have access to it. So this way I can exercise control over things. So for example, if I'm shipping some private data to be processed out in the cloud, and if the server in the cloud has such a secure hardware enclave, then I can execute my computation inside that. My application will have a bit of code running inside that enclave, and the OS cannot snoop into that data at all. So I can send encrypted data. The OS is going to be totally oblivious to it. A component of my application would be the only one who will see decrypted data and sort of process it and all. So I can still benefit from a cloud server and yet not have to reveal unencrypted data. So secure hardware enclaves exist for Intel processors, kind of the desktop, laptop class processors for the past, let's say, 4 or 5 years time frame. They have also begun to come out on Intel's lower end Atom class processors as well, so they exist there also. In ARM, there is something equivalent called Trust Zone, ARM Trust Zone, which plays a similar role, and until recently it was only on ARM's so-called A series processors, which is what you find on smartphones and all. But for the past year and a half or two, they also exist on some of ARM's M class processors, which are the more embedded type processors. So long story short, this secure hardware enclave is a nice practical solution. It lets you do some of the things that otherwise the crypto algorithms should do, but there is still an assumption out here. You are still trusting Intel or ARM or kind of the hardware vendor, and that comes with a question mark also, because it turns out that Intel's SGX, for example, has been broken via certain side channel attacks. They are more difficult to mount and all in some cases, but still one has to recognize that the kind of security properties you are getting here are still partly based on trust on the hardware platform, both that they are not malicious as well as that they are competent. So these secure hardware enclaves can be exploited in a variety of ways. So one example, this drone one, which one of my students did a few years ago, basically dealt with the issue that a lot of these drones now have third-party apps that you run, and these third-party apps issue commands which are actuation commands. But what if an app has been compromised and it commands the drone to crash, for example, okay, go down at high speed and all. So what we do in this case is that we run sort of a policing software in the trust zone, in the secure hardware enclave, and every actuation command which is going out, we reliably intercept it and validate that the end product would still be safe. That's kind of loosely what is going on. So you can imagine sort of all sort of other uses where basically you can have this trusted whatever software wrapper or shim which kind of can provide you certain assurances. So another direction for interesting projects is to really play with this technology, that is do some sort of secure sensing or secure actuation kind of work. Okay, another switching back to attacks. So another place where vulnerabilities occur is that most of our IoT devices nowadays, they typically have a cloud component or something which is running on the cloud, or some sort of user device on a smartphone or something like that. Okay, and so even though the firmware and all on your embedded device may be all fine, if someone is able to commandeer or compromise these other components, then you have a problem. So like, for example, imagine a company like Amazon with its shipping drones or robots in its factories and whatnot. They may be perfectly fine, but if the front-end software gets hacked into, then it can make those physical assets, those robots and all, do things which you didn't want to do. Like, so for example, and like now these personal vacuum cleaning robots have become quite common. Originally just iRobot used to make them, but this year there are probably 5 or 6 companies which ship these robotic vacuums, and some of them have cameras, and it's natural that a kind of attack you can imagine where you commandeer this robot to go into parts of the home, and then some hacker is able to kind of learn about things in your home. Now, one way it could do is if the software on the vacuum cleaner was commandeered, but then these things also come with associated apps and even web services. So if you can compromise those, then you can command the robot to do things that you didn't intend. Breaking the cloud component becomes important. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that when we send data to the cloud component, then I may not trust it, right? So if my sensor data from my devices, if they are going to a cloud service, then there is a potential privacy issue. And we see this thing play out between the approaches different companies have taken to processing private sensor data. So for example, Apple often talks about that how they never take the sensor data out of your device that is locally processed, and that if it is ever extracted from the device, then it is in an anonymized form with a random identifier and in using something called differential privacy, which effectively adds noise to it. So that's Apple's stance. On the other hand, companies like Google, the way they work is they basically say, look, trust us, give us permissions or not permissions, but we are going to take the pristine raw sensor data, and we are going to process it using services in the cloud. But because we are able to do this, our services are a lot smarter than Apple's. That's kind of the reasoning. So they are able to do things which potentially Apple couldn't, because just the amount of data and computing that's available. So that does lead to this thing that can IoT cloud service provider provide services without seeing the clear text data, right? So there are, one approach would be we push the service to the edge, right? So the data never leaves the edge, gets processed there, and that's increasingly a viable path because there are a lot of companies which have come up with accelerators and all, so you can process the stuff right at the edge. But still, when it comes to processing these things, there are two aspects to it. One is the execution speed of the model, but the other also is a lot of these models are pretty big. How big do you think some of these, like we hear a lot about different kind of models for processing computer images and all, how big do you think these models get? Anyone played with any of these? Huh? Yeah, sometimes, I mean, they have billions of parameters. So while you may have a neural accelerator on your edge device, it's unlikely you have gigabytes of memory on the device. Okay, so then the models are significantly pruned down. So you may have a accelerated model at the edge, but it is probably in all likelihood a lower fidelity model. So you sort of give some. So by the way, this suggests another project direction to explore is this sort of trade-off between what you can do at the edge versus what you can do in the cloud with the privacy preserving perspective, right? So kind of if I send to the cloud, the data should be encrypted and never exposed even to the model service directly, versus I do it on the device, but then I take a hit in the form of using a smaller model. So this whole notion, there are other examples, like for example services like Waze or some of the city services which try to monitor road conditions and all. They all kind of rely on people contributing data, and the challenge is that either that people will be are often unwilling to contribute data if it is of a privacy sensitive nature. So for example, people have shown that even though in Waze you sporadically send the data, but the way the system works is you can easily reverse engineer and track users, for example. So are there approaches to be able to do this kind of computation in a secure manner? Okay, so it turns out that this particular problem that I have some data X, I want to compute some P of X, but this data X is private and this P of X is also private. Okay, I don't want anyone to know X, and I also don't want anyone to know P of X. Can I still do it while making use of some server resources and all? So it turns out that these kind of problems have become practical under certain scenarios. Firstly, when there are few parties involved. So in this case, I'm from a single user, but sometimes it could be the following. There are a bunch of sensors. Let's say each one of us has a sensor. I have a reading, okay, and I want to compute some function of all these readings. And then each one of us wants to know that. Okay. For example, it could be we all took a reading and we want to know, let's say, what's the sum of that reading or what's the average of that reading. Okay. You can think of it as like an election. We all have a vote, private vote. We all want to know who's the winner. So we want to aggregate across the different classes, different candidates. So we all want to know that result, but we want our vote is private, right? So this problem is called as secure multi-party computation. That is, we want to securely compute a function over a set of values, and then everyone will get to know the result of that function. But we will not learn anything about the set of values other than whatever is revealed by the function, right? I mean, if, for example, if there were just two of us and we computed the sum, let's say I had X, you had Y, I computed X plus Y, but I knew X, then of course I will know Y, right? I mean, so that would be an undesirable situation. But beyond what is revealed by the function itself, I don't want to reveal it. So this problem is called secure multi-party computation. There is this whole homomorphic computation, which I described already. So the notion there is that I have X, I want to compute f of X. F is done on a server. Traditionally, I would either send X unencrypted, or I will encrypt X, but then give the server a key so that it can decrypt X. What homomorphic encryption does is it says that f of encrypted X is the same as encryption of f of X. So encryption function and f commute. So think about it, right? I mean, if this is true, then I can send encryption of X. The server will compute f of encryption of X, but since f of encryption of X is the same as encryption of f of X, so what comes back to me is encryption of f of X, and I had the key, so I decrypt it, I get f of X. So it's a beautiful capability, and it turns out that a subset of that called partially homomorphic, which basically says that I'm limited to linear expressions. Okay, I'm adding but multiplying only by constants. That can be done pretty efficiently, and it turns out a lot of machine learning, like linear regression and all these things, are all satisfy that criterion. So I can do a lot of types, a large, let's say, a substantially useful class of machine learning type things in this manner. And then I already talked about secure hardware enclave. So these are kind of variety of technologies that one has now access to create systems where you can do secure outsourcing of computation, processing of sensor data and all to the cloud, and do so in a private manner. Excuse me. Let's see. I'll skip this. So there have been lots and lots of incidences historically over CPS and IoT type securities. There are some incidents on oil pipelines. Perhaps the most famous one in recent times has been this Stuxnet, which I mentioned last time also. So this is where supposedly CIA and Mossad attacked the Iranian uranium enrichment facilities, and the way they mounted that attack was the following. So essentially, these type of systems found in the industry, they use this SCADA thing, which I kind of mentioned last time also. But essentially, what happens in SCADA systems is the following: there's kind of a front-end system, which are just general PCs and stuff like that, and this is where kind of you can monitor what's happening in the system, and you can also write programs. These are programs. Essentially, you can think of them as kind of finite state machines and all. They're very high level. Remember, this is done not by computer scientists. These programs are done by kind of the application engineers. And then down there is your physical plant, a robot or a ship or a factory or whatnot. And the computers that control them are called PLCs, which stands for Programmable Logic Controllers. But they're basically embedded computers. And the way these programs work is the following. They operate on a cycle, typically 10, 20 milliseconds. So they're basically in a loop. Every 10 milliseconds, they'll execute a program, and then again, the next 10 milliseconds, they'll repeat the same thing. And if you look at that program, it typically looks like read sensors, process the sensor data, write to the actuators. Okay, that's the nature of the program. They've existed for decades, like from 70s or so. And there's a whole kind of industry which caters to this market. And so, like I said, you find them essentially everywhere, probably in the walls of this building also for our HVAC system and all. And then you have these human-machine interface where people kind of interact with it. And over the years, they have kind of progressed with the technology curve. Now, what happened in Stuxnet was the following. The program gets compiled out here, written and compiled out here, and the firmware is sent to the PLCs. And it runs out here, monitors the sensors and does the processing and all, right? In case of the Iranian example, it was basically controlling the motors of those centrifuges, high-speed centrifuges, which is enrichment. The way the attack happened was that first initial thing was a human weakness. They got someone to take an infected USB stick and plug it out here. Okay, that caused malware to spread into the system. What this malware did was it infected the compiler. So now, when the program was compiled, now it had a malware injected into it. There was no protection. The program got sent out here, and what this program did was it caused the motors to spin at a much dangerously high speed, and yet the sensor reports which were sent back to the user interface out here made it appear as if everything was normal. So the operator sitting out here, they basically saw as if everything was okay, while meanwhile under the hood, the motors or the centrifuges were basically destroyed. So there are several issues out here. Firstly, kind of even though these were highly protected installations and all, there's always the human weakness that these were air gapped and all, but they were still able to get the malware in. And the second thing is that there was no check. Since then, there's a whole bunch of people who, after this attack happened, first reaction from security community was to analyze this thing and all. And then since then, a lot of defense mechanism. For example, one typical one is when the program is sent, there is kind of some independent entity in the middle which looks at that binary and analyzes it. That is this binary dangerous, right? So you don't have access to source code and all, but essentially before you install anything on the PLC, you are going to validate it. That is it a valid program? If it's a and is it a safe program, right? I mean, it still looks like a control program, but will it drive my system into a dangerous state? So that requires a fair bit of not simply software analysis, but also knowledge of the characteristics of your application, right? If I give you for example, a lot of control programs simply look like the following: take a sensor reading, compare it against the set point, whatever the operator wants, whatever is the error, compute some function of it, and then send it to the motors, for example, okay? And then repeat this process. And whether it is safe or not really depends upon the coefficients which are used in that function. I can perturb those coefficients and that same program becomes dangerous. So whosoever is analyzing that firmware has to kind of have sufficient knowledge about what is the safe regime and what is an unsafe regime. So it's not simply, oh, I decompile the binary and all work of it. It requires kind of a degree of domain knowledge that one may not have otherwise. Okay, let's see. I already mentioned this, the drone capture. Oh, yeah, please.
Is this internal verification like automated or?
Yeah, so there's a group at Rutgers. Actually, my postdoc, his PhD thesis. So yes, it is automated. Yeah, but bear in mind that the kind of systems you can do this kind of analysis for are because it's intrinsically domain specific, so they are still focused on some narrower class. But yes, it is automated. And typically what they do is they essentially have almost like a bump in a wire, right? I mean, there's a network going, except that now it's going through this independent box which validates before it lets it go further. Yeah. Okay, so the drone one I had already mentioned last time, so I'm not going to do it. Another one which is more recent is where a lot of I think these were cameras from some particular vendor. They were taken over because they were all using default passwords. So this is actually a big issue with IoT devices, that for some reason, I guess out of supposed simplicity, when you get them, they come with a common default password, right? You buy that cheap $10 box from Amazon, and all devices of that model will have the same password, right? So, and the second thing is, most users don't change that password. So it's a combination which makes it super dangerous. So of course the solution is simple, but since it adds a few cents to the process, so therefore it's not done. So for example, you might imagine that every device should come with a unique password, and then a sticker at the bottom of the device should tell you that password, right? So that would be super safe. What's the problem? Why don't they do it? Yeah, every firmware image would be different. So it just makes things ever teeny bit more expensive. So so therefore it's not done. I mean, good vendors do it, but so much stuff out there is kind of that nature. It's okay. In this particular case, after having taken it over, they mounted a denial of service attack on a DNS provider. Essentially, all these devices simultaneously sent a DNS request, domain name service request, to a DNS provider, brought that down, and therefore it caused an outage. This was, I think, in the Northeast. Okay. So 17 billion cost to the economy. Okay, and I was reading some data, like since the drone one, for example, was based upon GPS spoofing. I read a study that a GPS denial attack would cause a few $1 billion damage to Britain's UK's economy per day. Okay, so I mean, some of these technologies we are so reliant upon that an outage has severe economic consequences. Okay, so we are at the midway point. So we are now going to switch from security to privacy. Okay, so again, part of the intent for me to suggest to you project ideas. We touched a little bit upon it about this privacy aspect when we were talking about the machine learning, right? The privacy of the training data sets. Okay, but it's a more general problem. Privacy issues are also present in test data and all. So kind of fundamental challenge really is the following. We have sensors. We carry sensors ourselves. We visit places which have sensors. Sometimes those places are our own. Sometimes they are of third parties, right? I mean, so sometimes it's your home, the cameras at your home, and sometimes here, maybe there's some camera or whatever, motion sensors for sure. Okay, so what's happening is that these sensors, both individually are rich enough, but certainly in combination are particularly rich, that they really kind of, you can think of them as providing kind of a running real-time commentary on your life. Okay, if someone has access to all the data, from all the sensors that are capturing something about you, I mean, it's a pretty rich set of things. And if you open proceedings of conferences like UBComp and PERCOM and these kind of conferences, you would see that people keep publishing, and hey, we can infer this from the sensor data, hey, we can infer that. So there's kind of a long list of things. I mean, that you might imagine. From location, take something as simple as location trace, right? I mean, it's probably, actually, I shouldn't say simple, because I think short of taking a photograph and capturing your audio, location is probably the other most sensitive, most personal sensor data trace that you can imagine. What all can we infer from it? Of course, locations and places. While location trace only gives the GPS thing, but there is a Google Place API, so where you can easily reverse look up and find out what place you were at. From that, I can begin to infer religion. I always have kept location off from my Facebook app, so I don't give access to location to my Facebook app. And yet, I was in India over the winter break. I visited some relatives. And by the way, I also don't have any of my family members as my Facebook friends, and yet the person I visited to was the day after recommended to me as a potential Facebook friend. So what do you think happened?
Your data was recorded by some other app, not Facebook, which had access to
Exactly. Yeah, I remember.
GPS, and then
So that's one. And as I referred to last time, there are all these libraries that, so Facebook has its claws into all sort of apps and websites, okay, and while there I probably visited something and I have given access there, okay, so that's one possibility. Another one is potential relatives, right? I mean, so Facebook does know at this stage who my wife and daughter are, even though they are not my friends on Facebook, but since they tag my photos and all, so they certainly have that connection. And if they share location with the Facebook app, then my location, right? I mean, so you can see kind of how this location together with this ancillary information gets pretty complicated very soon. Inferring shopping habits, dining habits, hobbies, fetishes, these kind of things are super easy. Other kind of stuff, like for example, take inertial sensors. So inertial sensors are motion sensors in your phones, right? Accelerometer, gyro, magnetometer, so kind of 9 channels of sensory data. So they're capturing how I move, right? I mean, every sort of acceleration and angular motion and all, they kind of get captured. So our phones have it, and of course, besides the phone, I also have it in my little watch on my wrist. What all can be inferred from it? Okay, so on the top right, I've suggested some list. Certainly a lot of activities, right? Passwords. So on my phone, when I type the password, the accelerometer on the phone picks it up, and depending upon which handed you are, your wristwatch also picks up, okay? And so people have shown that passwords can be inferred. My driving behavior, aggressive driving kind of stuff. Some medical issues, people have shown that early stages of Parkinson's, for example, could be inferred from that. Sleep, sexual behavior, all these kind of things. Moreover, the sensors themselves have unique signatures. So what I mean by that is, let's say I were to take two iPhones, and I bundle them together, like rigidly tie them together and carry with me, right? So you would say, okay, they'll both capture exactly the same signal, right? They are a rigid body, I'm carrying them. But people have shown that you can still figure out which set of readings came from which phone, okay, because the sensors have tiny bits of noise and those patterns are unique. Or for example, if you take two cameras and you look at the images, then because of the subtle noise patterns, you can still figure out which image came from which camera, okay? So sensors have fingerprint, so that opens up with a lot of challenge as well. Moreover, I think things have certainly improved a lot, but early on when these devices came, the approach was the sensors are innocuous, so applications had very easy access to them. Nowadays, over time, these devices have clamped down more and more, although not yet to the extent that one would hope. So things like motion sensors and all are, and some of the more esoteric sensors are still kind of not as well protected. So what can we infer from sensor data? So let's look at home electricity usage. Right, so most homes nowadays have meters which capture data at granularity of seconds or even finer. So your utility company for sure, and actually a lot of other third parties have easy access to this data. And the reason I say is easy access because sometimes these meters transmit things wirelessly. So someone in the vicinity of home can easily pick this information up. So if you think about, and if you look at these profiles, they kind of look like these, depending upon what appliances are running and all, they kind of And from that, you can easily begin to infer what might you be doing. Like we are seeing the dryer running out here, so yeah, clothes washing took place. Television watching out here, stuff like that. So sort of lots of different kinds of things could be inferred, and this out here. So you can basically say from a single point I can infer a lot of support activities, and then use them also for all sort of purposes specifically. So the question becomes, how can I hide these things, right? I mean, how can I prevent unwanted inferences to be made about the activities, and yet utility company should still be able to bill me and stuff like that, right? I mean, that's kind of the challenge that occurs out here. So just to give you an example, and this potentially could be another area for interesting projects. So the idea out here is the following. I have a big screen TV, and as it is running, in order to optimize power consumption, manufacturers, what they do is they do very aggressive power management of the screen. So when the screen is all black, it consumes less power than if it is all white. And then if, as I was seeing, which is more blacks than color, then whatever brighter regions, then again power consumption differs. So if you look at the profile of the power consumption, then the signature reflects something about the content. So, and every video, for example, is going to have a different signature. And then so firstly, since these things are reasonably power consuming devices, they're easy to identify in the smart meter data. And then by looking at the profile and then matching it against known video content, like let's say Netflix movies and whatnot, I can say, what were you watching? Okay, what were other live channels, or were you watching this particular movie? So I can begin to infer habits like these. A potential project here you might explore is, so what other things a television emits which are of this nature? Well, power signature is one. Can you think of something else that is short of you sitting in front of the TV? Okay, I mean, so let's say there's a TV running on in a room, and so power signature was one. Can you think of some other signature which is kind of revealing of what the TV content is? And again, not sound. Okay, so sort of
light that's coming out.
the light, right? So often, I'm sure you've encountered this thing, right? You look across the street, your neighbor, and they're watching the same TV program, because whenever their TV goes bright, so does mine, right? So now imagine some app on your phone with the phone's light sensor monitors the brightness changes in your room, because you think you are watching a nice movie in the darkness of your living room, but it can potentially monitor. Okay, so so these are all kind of concepts of side channels, right? Where we are basically unintended leakage of information that is happening. There is this keyboard typing stuff that I already described. So when we type on the phone, the accelerometer picks up signatures, and the letters are at different locations. So when I press the A versus I press whatever U, then the signature is ever so slightly different. And then by combining it with sort of good processing, you can begin to infer what is happening. There's a paper which I'm going to have as one of the papers to be presented by the students. So you know how when we do Skype meetings or Zoom meetings and all, oftentimes it's so annoying that the other party is typing away madly, and you kind of see this background sound, right? What this paper shows is that by analyzing those sound clicks, you can figure out what was being typed. Okay, so so even something as innocuous as that, I mean, think of it as a click, but those clicks have slightly different sounds. Okay, another paper from the same group is at UC Irvine. So when you use the keys, there is a what they call as a thermal residue on the keys, as in like if I use a key a lot, because we emit heat, so to say. So there are slight temperature differentials. And what they showed is that up to 30 seconds and in some cases as much as a minute later, by analyzing that thermal residue, they can reverse infer what password was typed. Okay, so so there are all these sort of unintended side channels which exist, and I think it's again interesting, good area to potentially do some project. In all these cases, the nature of the project is collect the sensor data and then show that you can break into it. Okay. Another one, this one I found pretty cool. Started with a group out of Stanford, but some other people have shown this thing. So I talked about inertial sensors, accelerometers and gyros earlier, but I told you they are just motion sensors. But internally, the way these sensors work is they basically have on the chip itself, there's a tiny little mass, and that mass vibrates whenever there is acceleration. Except that it also vibrates whenever there are pressure waves. So, so when we have sound, there are two scenarios under which this accelerometer can pick up sound. One is if the sound is too loud, so the pressure waves are too strong and somehow they cause these things. But more commonly, the pressure waves cause the surface, so like as I'm speaking, the stable surface is probably vibrating ever so slightly, and my phone kept on it is picking up that vibration ever so slightly. And therefore, the accelerometers do see some signal which corresponds to the sound in the environment. And what this group showed was that we can recognize speech, gender of the speaker, things like that. And so anyway, so this is something that one would not have imagined, and certainly when an application requests that give me access to the accelerometer, typically the reason is, hey, I want to count the number of steps or something like that. But they will not reveal that, by the way, I can also learn something about what you were saying, or not simply what you were saying, maybe the nature of sound around you. So for example, if you are at, I don't know, like a Starbucks, the background sound is very different than if you are in a bookstore. So, so they can also begin to infer something about the type of location you are at. So there are all these things that one has to sort of worry about. Same thing could be done with gyroscopes. So you can infer sound from it. Okay, to the degree, like I said, speaker recognition, gender recognition, isolated word recognition, stuff like that. Phone fingerprinting via the accelerometers, I already referred to this thing, that the readings from the sensors themselves can be used to identify which device they came from. And since devices tend to be personal, so let's say I share data with one service. At a different time, I share data with a different service, but in an anonymized fashion. But because of these fingerprints, they can be linked back. So that's the threat that arises. Microphones have the same fingerprint. That is, you can distinguish, you can take a sound which was captured from one microphone at one time and link it with data from the same microphone at a different time. This is another piece of work. This was done by one of my own students many years ago, a couple of students. And the point I want to show out here is the power of what is called as side information. So when you are dealing with sensor information, it's not simply that sensor data. The attacker, the adversary, also has access to other information that is publicly available. So what's happening here is the following. Your phones have barometers. What do barometers measure? Pressure, air pressure, right? Air pressure relates to altitude, and air pressure also has relevance with weather condition, right? Okay, storm is coming or something. But in particular, they relate to altitude, and actually modern barometers are pretty sensitive. You go one floor up in Bolter Hall, it will change. It's sensitive down to a meter or so. Okay. So now imagine, now this information is viewed even now as pretty innocuous. So usually when an application needs access to barometer, they're open sensors. You don't need to give permission. A challenge in privacy has been that too many permissions cause problems also. If you're going to ask permission for everything from the user, then the user kind of tunes out. So this decision as to whether to seek permission or not has to be done kind of carefully to make the system still usable. So many sensors are therefore left unprotected. So barometers tend to be in that category. So now imagine you are walking around UCLA campus carrying your phone where you're given an app access to the barometer. So it's a weather app, and it's now capturing change in your altitude. After a sufficient period of time, when this time series of barometer data has been captured, now you can imagine that if you have access to a topographic map, which is easily accessible, there are open maps available, you can fit this curve on that map to identify what track you took, what trajectory you took through that space. Of course, it won't work if you were in whatever University of Las Vegas, all flat, but in a rich enough topography, this works fine. So that's what exactly we did. We basically captured this trace, and then using publicly sourced information and rough knowledge of location from what you would get from IP address, so that we're not searching over the whole planet, but only in a city's area, we basically fitted this. You have to deal with variation in speed, and also when you are doing this mapping, you have to stretch and shrink the time series. It's called a process called time warping, but we kind of did that and then sort of reverse engineered the location. So kind of another privacy attack. Another one, this is out of Stanford. So battery levels on your phone is unprotected, right? I mean, what is sensitive about it? Not much, you would think, right? But what this group showed was that from the battery level, from a trace of battery level over time, you can figure out again the trajectory, location trajectory. And the way it works is the following, that the location of the phone is correlated with the distance to the cell tower, right? So change, the distance changes. The distance to the cell tower affects the power consumption by the radio. From farther away from the cell tower, the radio has to transmit more strongly. And it so happens that besides the screen, the other big power consumer on your phone is the cellular radio. So if you isolate away the common mode power, the average power, and you look at the changes, those changes are going to correlate very strongly with the distance from the cell tower and therefore with the location. Now even that's obviously not enough. I still need to know where the cell towers are, but that's not information which is not hard to get, should we say. And then I probably need to make some other additional assumptions. In this particular case, they limited themselves to vehicular mobility, and again they had a general knowledge of which metro area they were in. In this case, it was out of Stanford, so basically they had a road map of Bay Area, and again by sort of fitting back this information, they could just figure out what trajectory you were taking. The message I want you to take away out here is that when you look at privacy, it's never just that piece of data. It is that data in context with all the other side information that an adversary would have reasonable access to. Okay, because if you ignore that, then you'll have a very artificial sense of privacy. So I guess another class of projects that you might think about is kind of showing some other similar things that could be mounted, where kind of inference that one would normally think would be hard to get, but should be you can show that what can derive so easily. So what's happening really deep down here is that there is very rich coupling of things in our world. Okay? Essentially, it's reasonable to say that every sensor captures everything around us. Okay, at some level. Permissions, is very hard to lock down everything behind permissions. So permissions is kind of a coarse seam. Okay, some stuff is so sensitive and certainly worthy of permission. Others really is a usability versus risk trade-off. the set of risks that we actually have keeps changing. Who would have thought that battery power is location? Okay, for example. Okay, so our knowledge expands as people kind of show what is possible. And then finally, kind of just generally there's a pretty liberal flow of information. And all of these things conspire together to kind of essentially kind of a problem which is hard to wrap one's head around. So, yeah, I'm going to skip this. So part of the challenge is that some of this data touches the data touch many different players along the way, right? I mean, it's not simply data and whatever your operating system on the device. It's shared with apps. When you share it with the app, it's presumably being shared with those embedded ad libraries, and then therefore shared with aggregated across. So by the time you kind of think of the implications, they get pretty tricky. So one way perhaps to get some handle around it is to really think in terms of what kinds of applications are using this sensor data. So one very common class of application is the following. I have kind of sensor data, and then I want to create some sort of a population scale model of statistics. I don't care about you, the individual, but I am engaged in an exercise where I want to know something about the population, mood of a city, or I want to learn a statistical model about traffic or health or whatnot. So in this case, my problem basically is I have a whole bunch of private sensor data, and I want to compute an aggregate function over that. So one way of doing it is we basically say, look, I decide that I'm going to trust someone, some trusted aggregator, and I give them the data, and under penalty of law or trust or whatnot, they compute the model, and then they publish the model, or they compute whatever statistics and they publish that. So in this case, I have placed trust in that intermediary, and that intermediary then is publishing models, statistics, answers to queries, while making sure that my privacy is not leaked, okay, is not violated. That model is fine, but there are two problems with it. Sometimes our data is just so private that you are just unwilling to trust it with any trusted intermediary, right? I mean, it could be private photos or stuff like that. Okay. So that's one issue. And the other issue is intermediaries are often incompetent, as in they may get hacked into and stuff like that. So while I may normally trust that intermediary, but almost every week or so there is some report about someone getting hacked into, and even your password or social security number and all getting released. So there are those two issues. So better would be if I don't even send pristine data out here. Okay? So encryption could be your help, and the other help is that we obfuscate the data. So let's say Waze is trying to get an estimate of traffic condition in LA. Okay, so a lot of users are reporting incidents, but so one stance we can say is that when we send data to Waze, we are going to add noise to it, right? So for example, maybe the incidents would be reported with some error in time and location. And our goal is that from a bunch of noisy readings where noise has been deliberately added, can Waze still reliably compute the traffic state? Right? That's, you can think the problem that way. In which case, we are saying these end users don't trust the intermediary, but the intermediary can still compute a reliable population level model. So that's the second model. And this whole problem space has been extremely active in recent years. There is this whole area called differential privacy, which has emerged around it. And so the first version where we trust the aggregator, and the aggregator publishes and potentially publishes by adding noise to it, Okay, is one model of differential privacy. Another one is that we publish, even the sensors send noisy data, in which case it's called local differential privacy. And what differential privacy provided, and in the later part of the course we are going to cover it, but again a great area for project things. The differential privacy makes the following promise. It says that the privacy promise holds true irrespective of whatever else the adversary knows. Remember, a problem we faced repeatedly was that if the adversary knows these other things like location of cellular data or map and all, it was able to break the sensor data. What differential privacy says is that we are going to add noise in a manner which is so principled that when I give you a response, then whatever else the adversary may know, it will not learn anything more than what it already know. Okay, so that's kind of the promise that it makes. And it's a pretty powerful promise, but the challenge is that coming up with algorithms which can provide that promise of differential privacy is often not possible, or not possible easily. So that's where the challenge comes, but in a broad range of things it works great. Like for example, if you're collecting data about power consumption of certain applications on mobile phones, let's say Apple is interested in that. So when they're collecting this kind of data, they can certainly do it with noisy data, but still reliable inferencing. So that's what happens here. A more challenging situation is a one-to-one situation where I have a single system and I'm interacting with a service provider, and I'm giving that service provider sensor data for it to do something with it. Let's say control my HVAC system, and the service provider already knows me, right? They have my name or credit card number, so they easily know who they are dealing with. And the problem I want to deal with is I want that service provider to provide me the necessary service or whatever I agreed to share with it, but not other things. So this is where the challenge comes, that I'm sharing some sensor data. You can compute two very different inferences from it. Let's say you can compute the number of steps, and let's say you can compute whether I have some particular heart disease. I want you to know the former, but not the latter. And so in this one-to-one scenario, it becomes pretty hard because my identity and all is already kind of known. Okay, so that becomes a tricky thing to deal with. So what do you think can one do out here? So let's take a simpler example. Let's say my wristwatch data. From this wristwatch data, you can infer a lot of things, like motion-related stuff, but also whenever I smoke, or people have shown people take drugs or stuff like that, right? So there are things you can infer from this data that you would rather the other party not know, and yet you are taking part in some medical study where they want to see how active you were. Okay, so I want them to not know whenever I'm that when I smoke or whether I smoke, but I want to get them a sense of my activity. So how do you think? What would my strategy be now? Yeah, so that's where a normal reaction, you can add some noise to the data, but what kind of promises you can make is. Huh? Okay, so I'm glad you said that. So if I chop out the data whenever I'm smoking, I censor it whenever I'm smoking, do you see a problem with that? Huh? Even worse. So if I give you a time series and I cut out the data whenever I was smoking, you know whenever the data is cut out, I was smoking. Right? So missing data itself is giving information away. So what would you therefore do? Okay, so you're getting close to it. Have a friend wear a watch, or basically put some synthetic stuff there, right? Yeah. So you want to cause doubt in the adversary as to something truly happened or not. And this is where things get even trickier. Let's say it was something truly embarrassing. Let's say it's about, I don't know, me taking cocaine for example. Okay, so I'll leave you guys guessing. But the point I'm trying to make is the following: even if I falsify, but even if there is some incident out there where you say, "Oh, Professor Srivastava took cocaine," even if I don't, even that false information is basically sufficient to embarrass me, right? I mean, so embarrassment. I mean, this is where we start getting into territory of deep fakes and all. Sort of we hear quite a bit about. So it gets pretty tricky pretty soon because the interests of the different parties are very different, right? Adversary may be out to learn about you or to cause embarrassment, and your goal may be conflict on the opposing side. So some of these problems, for them to be solved, one has to be pretty careful about what was the intent of the different parties and what are you kind of trying to achieve in this case. It's one thing to say that I want to create enough doubt that it will not hold up in the court of law, and that's very different than saying I want it not to hold up in the court of public opinion. There are two very different things, right? I mean, court of law requires a higher degree of validity than causing embarrassment on, right? So one has to be very careful about thinking about these problems. And what that goes on to show is that privacy is not just a technical problem; it's a social problem in part, right? I mean, one has to, when you're solving these things and all, you have to take that perspective. So, looking at it from a bit of a technical lens, so essentially what happens? So traditionally when we think about privacy, we really think in terms of confidentiality of data. I have some user, Alice. Typically all these security people like to talk in terms of Alice, Bob, and evil party Eve. So Alice has some secret, wants to send it to Bob, but doesn't want Eve to know it. So we basically use cryptography. We take our data, we encrypt it with a key and send it to Bob, and Bob also has that key. Somehow Bob has that key either because we met Bob previously or we use some public key cryptography system to kind of exchange the keys, establish the keys, like the way it happens in your SSH, for example, or VPN. Okay, and since Eve doesn't have the key, she can't break into this. Then another time we have this problem that we want to contribute the data, but it's enough if I can remain anonymous. So you often hear about these things that please share the data with us, we promise we'll anonymize you, which basically means we'll not use your name, zip code, something which is explicitly identifying. We are going to replace all of that by a random ID, and then we are only going to share it in aggregate. Anytime anyone makes this promise, be super careful. The problem is the following, that some kind of data like social security number, if you replace that with gibberish, then it has become gibberish. But other kind of data, like let's say the trace of your GPS, is very hard to anonymize. Will you share your GPS trace with me? Well, if you do, then I can immediately figure out your identity even though you didn't tell me your name, because how would you do it?
You'll be staying at a particular vicinity.
And so first thing you have to figure out is where am I staying? So how would you do that? Right. So over a period of days, or actually even after one day, wherever you were at night, that's quite likely your home, right? And then using white pages type services, kind of I can easily kind of break it down, right? I mean, and while GPS is obvious, it's actually let's say I share with you my accelerometer trace. Okay, and let's say you know some bit of information about me. Let's say you know where I work. Okay, but let's say my home address is a secret, and all you have is accelerometer trace. Can you figure out my home address? Okay, so some combination of dead reckoning and the time and all, you can kind of you can figure out the transport modality, begin to kind of narrow things down. You know my last name, so once you have that, how many Srivastavas are going to be there, you narrow it down and you'll figure it out, right? So This anonymization works fine with kind of simple kind of data records, but when it comes to sensory data, it's slippery slope. And in fact, even for ordinary data, it's pretty hard. Lot of attacks where anonymized data have been broken, and one of the most famous ones was this grad PhD student at MIT, who long ago PhD student. She's a professor at CMU now. Harvard, I forget where she is. She basically showed that how systematically she was able to de-anonymize the record of the governor of Massachusetts health records. Okay, so it's an anonymized medical database, and basically by combination of stitching information together and all. So the challenge is, while an individual field may look anonymous, when you combine it with other things, you basically are able to index them. So privacy of identity or anonymity is, I think one reasonable stance to take is anonymization is not possible, basically, at this point. Another thing is that even if you remain anonymous, if I can reach you and if I know enough about you, then I can still harass you, right? I mean, so I don't need to know your real world identity to achieve certain nefarious goals. Okay, so that's another thing to keep in mind. This third problem is really privacy of behavior, or really kind of protecting inferences. That is, I'm sharing data with you, validly so, you are an authorized user. So Alice is giving data to Bob, and this data had some private data which we can strip, some quasi-private data which also we can strip, but then the rest of it is this supposedly kind of innocuous sensory data. And then this Bob, who's doctor or friend or whatnot, is receiving it, and we shared with this Bob for purposes of making some particular inferences, which you can say is a set of functions which I want Bob to be able to compute. So if F1 or B and F2 or D, we are okay with it. But then I don't want Bob to infer other stuff. In particular, I don't want Bob to infer certain, what you can think of as a blacklist of functions. I don't want Bob to know that cocaine or what read certain type of books or stuff like that, right? So I want to exercise control over inferences that Bob is on. And this is essentially an impossible problem. Think about it, because you have to begin to articulate what else does Bob know or doesn't know, and all. So it becomes pretty tricky. But that's really often what we face. So just to give you an example, you might be part of a medical study where we want to know whenever the subjects in that medical study are getting stressed, but they don't want us to know whenever we get drugs. Okay. Or utility company, smart meter, they should be able to bill us. Maybe they should be able to do things like power management unit, which follows demand response, where they give you lower rates in return for saying that when the electricity usage level is high, you can lower your whatever, not use washing machine or things like that. But I don't want them to know activities of behaviors at my home. That showed that you could learn otherwise. So we want to do all of this stuff, and unfortunately, hiding behind the crowd is not an option here, because we are in a one-to-one scenario. Okay, so so that's kind of the problem that we often face. By the way, increasingly, what we are also seeing is that data like these are also getting used in police investigations, and also when you share sensory data, there are also legal ramifications. If you commit a crime, but data that you have shared willingly can be accessed by the police and used. So I was just a couple of days ago, I was reading an example of this guy who I think it was a murder situation, and I think the data from his Apple Watch proved that he was accelerometer data from his Apple Watch proved that he was lying. Basically, okay, it was time. The signatures didn't align with what he claimed he was doing whenever he was doing. Okay, so what are our strategies out here? So we are in this situation where we collect sensor data, we share it with this whole wild west of apps and all which kind of exist. So strategy 1 is share answers, not the data. Okay, so kind of just as philosophically, a safe strategy is to share whatever the end user needs and not the raw data. Okay, so this term I used borrowed from a professor at MIT who kind of put it in the sense of share answers, don't share the data, or in more security terms, it's often called as principle of least privilege. That is, in effect, the app needs to know how many steps I took. Don't give the app the accelerometer data. Give the app the number of steps, which basically means that all that burden of computing all of that has to be at the edge device, right? In fact, it has to be in the trusted part of the edge device. So you want to probably ideally do it in hardware or the operating system. You don't want the app to be doing it. But that's a good strategy. Are you free with this? Unfortunately not, because even sharing answers often reveal things about other answers, right? I mean, for example, even let's say if I were to just share with you every time I take a step, okay, so or whatever, some time window, every 5-second window, how many steps I took. Well, over a long enough time, even that can begin to reveal a lot, okay, other things, right? You can still do some crude form. I mean, let's say you know roughly my height, you can kind of figure out roughly step size, you can now begin to translate back into some additional information. So while this helps a lot, not always the answer, but it does also require this embedding kind of more intelligence on the edge devices and whatever issues come with that. Another strategy is selectively obfuscate the shared data. And we had some discussion a short while back, censoring, adding noise, replacing with a friend's data, all those kind of things. None of them are perfect, but perhaps it does get you somewhat closer, or at least gives you the illusion of safety. There is one strategy which, or class of methods, they are often referred to as k-anonymity methods. And what k-anonymity methods do is they basically say that we are never going to share an individual's data. We are always going to combine it with data from a few other nearby individuals and then share the average. So k-anonymity, basically k users nearby, we are going to combine it. So like for example, instead of giving my location, we are going to give the average location of k nearby users, so something along those lines. Again, they can all be broken. Yeah.
Sorry, on which device these data from key users are combined?
Great question. So presumably some trusted device. So in that case, there is the assumption that there is a trusted intermediary. So for example, let's say it could be a device in the neighborhood which combines data from the smart meters in that neighborhood before it goes out. But you're making a very valid point. I have to trust that device. Okay, so so selective obfuscation, and it raises kind of a whole bunch of issues, and basically there's no, like, everything that has been proposed has been broken, and which is why differential privacy came about eventually, because it provides a theoretically grounded stuff. But it's very hard to anonymize, and also kind of all these ad hoc approaches, add random noise, censor certain part of the data, selectively falsify, kind of lie in different places. And as I showed, that even things like simply censoring, like that can give away. What about random noise? Let's say I add noise. Well, that doesn't work. So a great example of that is that when GPS was introduced back in 70s and 80s, they decided that the civilian signals are going to have Gaussian random noise. What's the problem with that? So idea was they wanted to not allow GPS receivers to have good location comparable to the US military, so that whatever other militaries cannot use GPS to operate effectively. What problem do you see with GPS noise? Gaussian noise. Right, exactly. So if I can, okay, so this is how. Firstly, if my stuff is reasonably static, I can combine over a course of time and just, okay. The other thing is that the way they added this Gaussian noise in a nearby area is the same noise. So I can have one device whose location I know precisely. I use standard surveying techniques and all and find its location, perhaps by averaging over time. And then I have other nearby, and then I can broadcast the noise, the location it is seeing. And then all the other users nearby, we can cancel out the Gaussian noise. So essentially, while they added this stuff, people just found this way around, and that whole thing kind of is called differential DPS. So it basically got accuracy pretty good. So late 90s, they kind of then disabled that whole selective disability system. So now let's take another version of it. I share with you my DPS trace, but I add, let's say, 100-meter Gaussian noise to it. Can you find out my, 100-meter Gaussian noise to it. Can you find out my precise home? You look at the end of the trajectory every day, and on an average, like again, you look at the average over multiple days, and you will find it, right? Because they're going to intersect at some circle, and my house will be at the center of that circle. Okay, so adding noise is basically a fool's gold. Okay, it's not going to generally doesn't work out. Selective suppression, where the act of suppression itself leaks, is this leaking. And selectively falsifying, one has to be super careful, because if I can detect that the data is synthetic, then it's a giveaway. So just like people are producing deep fakes and synthetic data and all, there is also a line of research which is trying to detect fake data. And for simple faking strategies are very easy to identify. So this is a tricky situation, but that's what it is. Okay, so I'm out of time. We are going to pick it up on next week on Tuesday. So again, tomorrow I'm going to hold 2 office hours. Those of you came in late. One is the 12 to 1, and the other one I'm going to do 4:30 to 6. But come and do start conversation with me.